an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Well, here we are. Where have you been, by the way? Welcome in. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And the legislature's back in business, and so are we. So, recovering from our long winter's nap, and we're all set to go. Back in the studio, John Wright is here from Maru Public Opinion. Keith Leslie, you hear and see him on CHTV, also a fairly regular contributor to the O Show with Laura Babcock. And Sabrina Nanji is here, the publisher of Queen's Park Observer. So, there's, we've been off for a while. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot that we can kick around. And so I'm just going to suggest that the theme for this is back on track. That seems to be the political theme at Queen's Park. It certainly was the political theme at Toronto City Council, and those two lanes overlapped considerably over the last 2 or 3 months. But we'll call this sort of the omnibus bill podcast, Sabrina, because there's lots in there that's talking about and all kinds of interesting nuggets. On your radar, what is it that we should be paying attention to that isn't getting the noise or the attention otherwise? What are you looking at there?
I mean, that's a great question because I feel like I've lived a lifetime this past week, and it was a short week because it started with a long weekend, right? But I mean, it's been a lot. There's a lot to look at. I think the omnibus bill is a big one just for a lot of reasons. I think the politics behind it, 2026 is a long ways away, but it feels like we're in campaign mode weirdly. And I think this theme of getting back on track is what we're going to be looking for from the Ford government. Obviously, they want to change the channel from a year of policy reversals and backtracks and scandals. But as much as they might like people to forget, the opposition was really holding their feet to the fire and, reminding folks about the number of disasters that they've had. Bill 124, the Greenbelt, changing their mind on Peel Region. I could go on and on. But I do think that a lot of focus was also on Bonnie Crombie this week because the Ford Conservatives have tried to wedge her and get her to come out and say something on the carbon tax. I mean, everything just feels very politically charged these days at Queen's Park. So I'm going to kind of be sifting through to see what's actually going on the policy side, which obviously we can't forget about. Yeah,
John, and you've said this many times in terms of the whole approach to Bonnie Crombie, that she has allowed so far the Tories to define her. And I think the carbon tax issue has only gone further in doing that because she's been slow in responding to it, slow in having a position on it. And it doesn't matter if, later today or next week she comes out with some detailed policy around how do we value carbon, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. All of that delay has allowed the Tories to say she's the carbon tax queen. It's just going to be more expensive for her. They've defined her on that issue.
Yeah, they've defined her on taxing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
That's been their big card. And I have to say, I've been relatively surprised at how slow and how diffuse Bonnie Crombie's responses to all of this stuff has been. Even when she got asked outside of the legislature on the carbon tax, it just seemed like, she could have just simply said for a soundbite, this is a federal jurisdiction. It's not for us to take a look at, and it's certainly not a priority for Ontarians right now when they've got X, Y, and Z, even though they may not be the priorities. I mean, there's a way in which you frame this, but it seems to me that since she's got the leadership, they were even starting to poke holes at her to run in Parham Gill's riding, right? And her response to that was kind of ambiguous as opposed to, it was kind of like, I'm looking at it. Like any good op staff would know these are the things that you should be watching for. So I don't know whether or not is that they just don't have the right people doing this or whether it's her. and that she, in her own way, is basically saying, look, I'm Bonnie Crombie, I can run the show. And as a result, she gets into these circumstances. But I've been very surprised that it hasn't been brought to bear over the last number of months. Very, clipped series of responses to many of these questions.
Yeah, Keith, in that respect, though, it's just another shiny thing that the Tories can dangle out there and put in front of media, put in the headlines, and fodder on podcasts and talk shows. We're talking about Bonnie Crombie, and we're not talking about what the hell the Tories have done in the last 2 years. The point being, if we're finally almost 2 years into this latest mandate, and they're saying, let's get it done. They got the omnibus bill. It begs the question, what the hell have you done over the last 2 years?
Well, what's their carbon policy?
Well, there
if they're
you
going to
go
go after Bonnie Crombie. We've seen them, rip out EV charging stations and come back in, being on the side of electric vehicles and being opposed and back on side. I mean, they themselves are just, they're standing on sand on any environmental issue, quite frankly. And one thing, Mike Crawley from CBC pointed this out this week, was interesting because, as Sabrina noted, Bonnie Crombie's name was virtually in every answer from a Conservative minister in the legislature. That's because if she does run and wins that seat in Milton, they can no longer use her name. They have to use the riding. And so they're using the name Bonnie Crombie in every, tax raising answer they can give. Their answers, of course, had absolutely nothing to do with the question. They're being held to the feet of the fire. Sabrina said on Bill 124, on other reversals. This omnibus bill should just be called straight up bullshit. I mean, come on.
Can we outlaw omnibus bills, by the way? I don't care who puts them on the table. I mean, no, seriously. Like, it is sort of this Trojan horse bullshit all the time.
Like a referendum, a future government, provincial government would have to have a referendum on a carbon tax hike. No, they wouldn't. You can't bind the hands of a future government. They would just pass a law and say we don't have to do that. Or go back to the example of Mike Harris and Ernie Eves' Taxpayer Protection Act, that you couldn't raise taxes. Well, Dalton McGuinness just, okay, it's a levy. It's a fee. It's a whatever. And we raised your health tax by $800. You can't bind the hands of a future government.
Even though Dalton signed the document that said he wouldn't raise taxes. Remember that.
There's that. Road tolls. We're going to stop road tolls on roads that don't have tolls. And the roads that do have tolls, well, we're not going to do anything about that. The 407. What? I mean, again, just nonsense stuff they're just putting out there that they really... license registrations. We're going to cancel that because there's 1 million unregistered drivers. Why? Because you canceled the fee that you had to pay every year on your birthday, which is a reminder. So now there's 1 million people driving. Well, we'll fix that. We'll wipe that out. What's going to be the unintended consequences of that? So there's all kinds of things we should be talking about besides Bonnie Crombie. But the PCs, that's all they're going to talk about, especially in the legislature when they can actually just slam her away in every answer. And when they soon, perhaps when she gets a seat, won't be able to actually use her name in there.
Yeah, I guess the whole tenor and the tone of these first 3 days. It's only been, to your point, 3 days since the break before Christmas, Sabrina. There was so much froth around it. And to your point, we're in a campaign mode already. It feels as if, aside from the bumper sticker labels that we're going to put on many things, I don't see an agenda that gives me any sense of direction where we're going to be a year from now, because a year from now we'll really be in election mode. What is set out to be accomplished between now and, next spring?
Yeah, I think like Keith kind of touched on this, like for all the political circus shenanigans that are happening right now, it's like really what's going on the policy side. If you look at that omnibus bill, I mean, it's kind of a joke. Of course, you can't bind the hands of a future government, and it's so politically charged, but I think for the Ford government, a lot of conservatives that I talk to, like even small C conservatives, like not Kool-Aid drinkers by any means, they're like, this is a complete missed opportunity because, I mean, as much as the Ford government loves to say that they've inherited a healthcare crisis, they've been in power for 6 years now and things are still pretty bad. And meanwhile, they've got this second whopping majority mandate. They can pretty much do anything. And it's like, what are the legacy projects here? Like, what are the long thinking Tory, pieces of policy? And I think, for the premier, he's all about highways, the Ontario line, redoing Ontario Place, these things that have been really political hot potatoes and controversial. But I think for a lot of people, they really want something that's like, conservatives can point to and say, we really made a difference on that. And this is like, regardless of what you think of or how you feel about their policies and what they're projecting, I just think that it does feel like it's just campaign. And then when it comes to actual governance, there's not really much meat there. It's been a lot of backtracking, especially from this government. And so I think that, there's only so much time left till 2026. And the conservatives, I mean, even though they're winning in the polls, we're starting to see the liberals make up the gap. And there are like these cracks forming in key territory. So I do think that there's still time for them to make a comeback, I guess. But I'm not really even sure what's going to come down the line or if it's going to be really significant or meaningful at all.
Well, John, to your point around the Liberals sort of appearing to be flat-footed vis-a-vis how they're putting Bonnie Crombie out in front of us, the Tories are similarly seem rudderless on that part. But the other part of this, and we've said this earlier, maybe 6 months ago or so, that what's going on in the background politically is one thing, but what's going around on the background with other levels of government is something else. And I still think that as critical as I was of Olivia Chow when she took the mayor's chair here in Toronto, she might be Doug Ford's secret weapon to surviving anything that comes his way because, man, not only are they getting along, he has really sort of helped sort of calm the waters politically in Toronto. When we were looking at a $1.8 billion hole in the budget, Chow can come along with her 9.5% tax hike for homeowners, and nobody blinked, right? So to me, it's almost as if, great, we're back on track here, we're moving forward. And so I don't know whether it was by accident or design that the province is using the same kind of language in getting us back on track, because it seems as though everybody's pulling together. If they're on the same page and everybody likes what Olivia's doing, it may not be a bad thing for Ford.
Well, let me just say that the 9.5% tax is an average. There are a lot of us who blinked and then choked because we know what's coming, and we don't live, in massive homes. But to the point that you've made is that the relationship between Doug Ford and Olivia Chow is almost familial. I mean, they've, when they got together, they exchanged photographs, they exchanged not just pleasantries, but they get on really, really well. And then this week, of course, talking about the housing starts that Toronto has made, you get a whole whack of more money. You put on top of that the uploading of infrastructure and a whole bunch of other things to it. Toronto's made out pretty well in the last few months. I mean, I put that in contrast with John Tory, who seemed to go down to Queen's Park and talk all the time, but then that's kind of what John does, right? He's like talk. So they have done well. I think what I want to circle back on is something that Sabrina said, though, and that is, if you look over the last 5 to 6 years of this government, everything is kind of retail politics transactional, and we did touch on this before. There's no legacy stuff here. It's almost like it's a grocery store, and you're going shelf by shelf. It may be that you're pulling in $531 million in profit in the first quarter or something like that because you've switched to no-name brands. Oh, am I mocking somebody? You're doing all this sort of stuff, but it all seems like somebody who knows how to wrap chicken. That's kind of what they do. They don't sort of manage the farm. They do these transactional things. So even the Staples deal on Service Ontario, I mean, there is a case that you could make rather than get it done is kind of like closer to you, where you want to bring things out. You want to get people closer and to where they want to go and what they want to do and how they can be served, or some kind of overarching theme. But I mean, we've got big problems in this province, let alone the country, not only on healthcare, but senior care, which is, we've heard reports this week about home care, which is going to be a huge issue here. And it seems like all the low-hanging fruit transactional retail stuff is what's being addressed by this government and not the big stuff. So I'm with you. I don't know where the legacy is. Except I do know that if you're a Politico, you look at certain numbers, and if this government is at 37 to 41%, depending upon the polls, then you're doing just fine. I mean, that's what you got a majority there, whereas Mr. Trudeau, in fact, is looking like getting wiped out. So I maybe as long as the numbers hold up, that's what they do. But I just find it fascinating that when you do have that amount of power, when you do have that large majority, that you don't take advantage of it and do big things with it. And that is a hallmark of this group at Queen's Park. It's all kind of retail.
When was the last
stuff.
time that happened? I mean, really, Keith, when was the last time we saw a government that had a forceful majority have some kind of legacy piece? And you might negatively or positively go back to
McGuinty shutting down the coal plants.
Sure.
But then
That's
negated
one.
it with the gas plant scandal. But those were big. I remember Hazel McCallion used to complain, the last big infrastructure project in this country was a Confederation bridge to PEI. There hasn't been many, major things since then. She had a point.
Exactly.
But to the idea of Doug Ford and the Conservative government's legacy, I think it's very much apparent. Their legacy is going to be increased privatization of healthcare, surgical clinics being privatized. The Ontario Health Coalition, one of the more respected agencies that keeps an eye on government spending and government actions, they've been around for a long time. They basically came right out with a report this week and said, they are literally robbing the public healthcare system to pay private for-profit clinics. They're paying 2 to 3 times as much for the surgeries in these clinics, while the hospital operating rooms are sitting empty. We've discussed this before. We could expand the use of our hospital operating theaters, evenings, weekends more, and we wouldn't need to use these private clinics. They're absolutely, and they're spending more to do it. Why? And we've had report after report about the outcomes from the private clinics or the private long-term care homes being far worse than the public run ones. Why are they going to? This is their legacy. They're standing behind it, and they shoot down anyone. You're just opposed to innovation. Why does the innovation have to be when progressive conservatives are in power to run down the public system and claim that only the private sector can save us? But we're going to have to spend 2 to 3 times as much. It goes back to the agency nurses thing, which is, the hospitals are spending so much on agency nurses. In Northern Ontario, it's like 7 to 8 times what they're paying for staff. In the South, it's 3 to 4 times. Well, there's money that's not going into the emergency department or getting nurses to keep beds open. So people are being backed up in ambulance bays and emergency help for hours. Ambulance drivers aren't even limited to spending their entire shift in an ambulance bay waiting to discharge patients. All of this comes down to where you're spending your money. And the money is clearly being spent to further profits in the private sector in the healthcare system. And we know there are billions upon billions of dollars to be made there. Yes, outcomes can be speeded up if you paid 3 times as much to a private sector and leave your hospital ERs closed or operating rooms closed. But why? This is their legacy, and I think it's going to be one I hope that haunts them.
But isn't it a case, Sabrina, and I appreciate Keith's passion on this, and he makes the point, and we've talked about this a lot lately. But there's a public acceptance of this, generally speaking. Either it doesn't affect me directly, so I don't give a rat's rectum, or I can find a way now to get in and have my treatments faster and get if that's going to speed up the system, then I'm okay with it. That's got to be the overarching response publicly. Otherwise, I don't think they'd be doing this.
Yeah. I just want to also quickly respond to your question about legacies, because I would say that Kathleen Wynne had these big projects. Cap and trade was huge at the time. And also when she had the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan, which never really went anywhere, but it kind of prompted CPP expansion. I mean, those were huge legacy projects. And actually, Ford's cancellation of Ontario's cap and trade is kind of what triggered Ottawa's carbon tax that he really hates in Ontario. But to your question about healthcare, I mean, yeah, I think, the public knows and generally accepts the private sector has a hand in this, and anyone who's had anything to do with the healthcare system, like in the last few years, I mean, I'm sure that, drastic measures need to be taken, and they're okay with that being, shouldered by the private sector too. But I think where things become scary, I mean, I'll just say is where you hear these like horror stories of upselling, the complaints about cataract surgeries in the news that just came out about that. I mean, just the health minister, Sylvia Jones, I've said it before, she really needs to work on her bedside manner, because the way she just sort of brushed off questions about that. I mean, these are generally elderly people who can't see well. And, being upsold on things and then like complaining about it. Like obviously they felt that they were bamboozled in some way. And I thought Sylvia Jones like really did not sympathize with, these people's experience. And that's where things get scary. And that's where you need like really tough regulations and oversight, which the government has kind of been dithering on that part of it as well. I mean, the oversight body for these private clinics and their expansion on what they can do for OHIP funded like surgeries and diagnostics and procedures, like that has long been promised, and they took a really long time to even get the ball rolling on that. So I think that's where the Ford government needs to do a lot better if they want to go forward with like furthering privatization, which I think they do. They need to make sure that the oversight and accountability is there, because otherwise I think we're going to hear a lot more of these like health horror stories that we've been hearing.
So can you put that toothpaste back in the tube, John? I mean, once we go down this road, we can complain all we want, but once you get to a point where there's diminishing return all of a sudden.
I don't think you can put it back in the tube at all. But I think, again, I go back to this and sort of say you have to have a vision for what you're trying to do. And you're absolutely right that the current health minister is rarely seen, rarely speaks. And when she does, oftentimes, it's a glib answer to something that you want better perspective on. But let's remember that she was the one that I think also triggered the Service Ontario issue, because she said, we're just going to save $1 million. Well, I think part of this is just the art of the politics as opposed to the art of the policy. And I don't think when you were talking about this, I was sort of thinking back over all the different regimes that we've seen going back to, my earliest days watching the Davis regime. There are ministers who are very good. They're very deft at doing this sort of stuff. But a lot of these ministers don't seem to have that skill set. They don't seem to have a vision that they can kind of lock into. So when you ask about whether we can put something back in the tube, I'm not sure what that tube is. Like, I don't know where you go with that. And again, I think that we've got some huge issues dealing with, an overaging population, home care, a lot of legitimate things that need to be addressed. And I don't see how it's being addressed or focused right now. So I think there's going to be a lot more toothpaste coming out of that tube before anything really gets addressed.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of, sort of the outrage around, Ford and his buddies, Ford and this. Keith, that becomes a wall of noise that people generally are tuning out, I think. I appreciate the basis of the criticism, but the more I talk to people just generally, they've tuned that kind of noise out entirely.
I think you're right. I think because they believe all politicians behave the same way once they get in power. So when they see something like, the Service Ontario contract going to Staples, this U.S.-based hedge fund run company that's heavily debt-ridden, and apparently we're going to give them $8 million in change over 3 years, that would have cost us, what the existing landlords, something like $3 million in change. So why are we giving them this kind of money? It seems absurd to be taking small businesses, which would be the core of the PC support, and putting them out of business, to give it to Staples, to give it to other big box stores. What on earth are they thinking about with this kind of policy? It just reinforces this. Doug Ford is out for the big guy, not the little guy. We see shoppers, turns out they're using med checks, phoning up people all the time and say, you need you get your right meds, you get this, boom, that's $75 to the system. Used to be a pharmacist decided when that was done. Now the accountants are telling them you need to make X number of these calls because you can bill the system $75. All of this is all set up to reward the big companies. We saw the partial business case for the Staples deal. They looked at nothing but big companies are going to help out here. Why were they taking this away from small operators? I still no reasonable explanation for that. And their response when the minister was pressed, well, no one gets a lifetime contract. Well, an Austrian Sprague got a 95-year contract. That's good enough. I mean, explain yourselves. Why is it always big companies that are getting rewarded and little people that are being put out of business or being roughshod over by this government? I think it's clear.
Well, the whole point of long-term lease, and that came up again in the with the toll roads, Sabrina, and everybody's pointing to the 407 when we're not rolling that one back. It's worth noting that half of the 407 stretch is owned and operated by the province that collects the tolls. So I'm even there. I'm shocked that they didn't say we're going to actually eliminate the toll on the part of the road we control. They can't do much about the original stretch.
Yeah, I guess to John's point that, do we have competent ministers? I mean, the thing is I've complained about this one question, one follow-up format now that I don't think we're going to really get rid of. But yeah, when the transportation minister, Pramit Sakaria, sort of, when he was asked about the 407, like sort of said, well, it's private. And that's like, well, there wasn't really an opportunity to kind of like cut him off and say, with due respect, no, you own part of it. Like, why can't you do anything about it? But again, this is just like red meat for their base. And even though they are doing well in the polls, I think the Liberals are kind of gaining some traction now, especially in key spots. So that's why we're seeing a lot of motorist friendly policies. The making license plate renewals automatic now, which I guess was kind of them fixing an issue of their own making. But again, still part of like this whole package of motorist friendly policies, highway stuff, all that. Because obviously the GTA is key for them. And that's where Bonnie Crombie is especially well known and popular. But I actually kind of think Mike Schreiner had an interesting solution to solving traffic congestion woes, which is obviously, obviously helping that would be making a highway, even though the numbers on that have been called into question. But essentially Schreiner's pitching that, trucks should be subsidized. Their tolls should be subsidized on the 407. So that way you get trucks on the 407, get them off the 401. It seems like actually a pretty smart solution. And I think that's like a lot of what we assign to Green leader Mike Schreiner, that he's kind of got these well thought out policies that don't feel so partisan. Of course, they're all about the environment and stopping climate change and tackling climate change issues. But I thought it was interesting this week for the policy nerds out there. That's a term of endearment because I'm also one. But Green leader Mike Schreiner has this housing bill that would legalize fourplexes like province wide rather than having municipalities and their councils sort of sort that out, which is what we're seeing piecemeal. And this would address density and our housing crisis. And that's all part of that. But it was up for second reading and the Conservatives used their majority to bypass the debate on this and send it straight to committee where it can essentially languish until the election and not go anywhere. So I just think that was interesting that they did that. I wonder if they're going to bring their own legislation and then just take the credit for it, or if they just don't want, the clips and the debate and, the inevitable attacks on their own housing record. They've kind of already done that with the Liberal MPP Stephen Blaze's pitch. He had a private member's bill of his own to, further punish counselors who are, found guilty of breaking the code of conduct, like harassment, that sort of stuff. And the Conservatives say that they're going to do it on their own, but they shut down this Liberals private members bill. Obviously, they wanted to get the political cred for that. So I just think that I'm probably going on a bit of a tangent now, but I just think it's really interesting how these policies that are thoughtful are just getting brushed to the side, because obviously everything is about who's the one pitching it and who gets the credit at the end of the day.
Well, even the whole idea of, having trucks shifted to the 407, John, is a relatively easy thing to account for and say it's good for everybody because, we've all driven the 401 through the GTA, and there isn't a stretch there that's longer than maybe 500 meters that isn't full of potholes and, broken up asphalt and et cetera. And why? Well, because we got a lot of heavy trucks traveling that every day, every hour. It's probably the busiest, one of the busiest highways in North America. So if you were able to move even half of those trucks off that road, imagine what you'd save in maintenance alone on the 401. There are ways to actually account for that and make it easy, kitchen table, eye level, however you want to call it, but make it make sense in the long term to actually take care of that. We're moving stuff through the GTA on a faster basis, and it's better for the environment because not only are we moving trucks, off there, or we're less congestion, we're not creating and manufacturing as much cement because that creates an environmental dent and all those things. There's an easy way to do a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and it's not the first time we actually have heard it. I mean, if you say it's a well thought out policy, maybe so. He's got all kinds of metrics and things to go with that. But the reality is that we have heard people every time we get into a situation where it has been jammed on the 401 over the last decade. The Ontario Truckers Association and others have come out with a very similar thing where they've said, we've got ways in which we can deal with this. I think what I reflect on during this conversation, however, is that Sabrina is the only one that's mentioned the party that's officially in opposition. You've mentioned it once, the NDP. Mm-hmm. We have had no discussion on this podcast about the leader of the opposition, whose first question out of the gate was, "Hey, Premier, why don't you say you're sorry to what you did to all those nurses," and then sat down. I mean, I watched, most of that question period and the next couple of days. It's kind of like, where is the biting aspect to this? Where is the opposition? The questions that the NDP had were just batted away like flies at the cottage. So I think I have to wonder, we've talked about every leader inside and outside of the legislature except the one that leads off with the questions. And I don't know what they're up to, but I think it's been an incredibly weak start out of the gate.
Yeah, Sabrina, I think that was it's funny how when you bring it up, it was unnoticed until you bring it up and then, oh my, that's a big issue.
Yeah, I'm with John. I did not think the NDP had a strong start to the session. I mean, I do think Marit Stiles has kind of, settled in a bit to her role as official opposition. Like she's newish too, just over a year. But yeah, asking about Bill 124 when the government is kind of already rolled over on that, it's like there's so many other fires that you could be talking about that are more relevant. And I understand, the government's always giving their talking points, but I really think the NDP lacks like a pit bull. Like when you're watching, like the House of Commons, I know that people talk about it being toxic, but really like when you even watch the Premier, and he has been there, quite a lot this week, relatively speaking, like he gets riled up when he talks to the Liberals and they only get one question, like because they're independents and don't have recognized status technically. So like we can see that he's not really registering Marit Stiles and the NDP as much of a threat. And so I think that, this is probably the worst week of all is for the NDP and Marit Stiles, because Bonnie Crombie doesn't have a seat in the House, but she's a bit of a media darling. I mean, the press is always going to be where she's at and calling her to get her take on stuff. And Ford has his sights set on her. So I agree with John. I think, the prospects for the NDP are probably more worrying than the other two parties at this point.
Okay, so before we go, I just want to go around the table. Keith, should Crombie run or sit outside the legislature and fire her snowballs?
Oh, I'd run. If Milton's available, it's right next door. If I was her, I'd run. I'd get in the legislature and start defining herself. That there's just so much attention paid by the media to question period, to what goes on in the House. If I was her, I'd get in there. John, in or out?
In. If it's there, she's going to be criticized either way. Might as well jump in and get going.
Sabrina?
I'm going to say out because I don't think she needs a seat. They don't have that much, time in the House anyway. She's going to get the press coverage no matter what. I think there's a possibility she could run in Mississauga if Khalid Rashid resigns before the next election. So there might be a spot for her there. But I think that she needs to make up her mind either way ASAP because they're losing precious time that they could find a candidate that could actually beat whoever runs for the Conservatives, because it was a really close race the last time around. And even if it's not her and her candidate won, she could still take credit for that. And there's a lot of, criticism aimed at the Ford government. So it might be tricky for them to hold on to that in a by-election for sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the out might be better for her and organizationally for the party to be able to get out into the town hall meetings, the barbecue circuit, all of those sorts of things that I think that the Liberal Party, let's not forget that it was almost an existential threat to their existence the last two campaigns. They can't afford to screw this one up. So having her in, I'm not sure that there's longer term political capital in there. Anyway, I do think you're right, though. Either way, they've got to if they're going to make a dent, they got to make it in Milton, and otherwise, it might be a tough slug the next 2 years for the Liberals. All right, that will do it. Back in the saddle, and we're going to be back here next Friday as well. So thanks for joining us. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. If you like what you heard, leave us a comment. share the show. If you didn't like what you heard, well, leave us 2 comments. Just explain yourselves because we want to really understand what your problem is with us. You can find me on social media at Dave Trafford. We'll get to me on X, on Instagram, Facebook, Threads even, and LinkedIn. Yes, I spend a lot of time on all those places. Be happy to hear what you have to say. All right, that'll do it. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast for Stories Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.